Hello, it is my privilege to introduce Bernard Comrie, the Hermann and Klara H. Collitz Professor. The Hermann and Klara Collitz Professorship is actually the oldest of the LSA named professorships. Hermann Collitz was the first president of the LSA, which, as we all know by now, was founded in 1924. He and his wife Klara both studied Germanic philology. After Hermann and later Klara passed away, they left a bequest to the LSA to establish the Hermann and Klara H. Collitz Professorship for Comparative Philology. And specifically in her will, Klara said that I mean the term Vergleichende Sprachwissenschaft, or comparative philology, in the sense my husband used it, i.e., including not only Germanic philology, ancient and modern, but likewise classical and oriental philology, combined with phonics, folklore, mythology, ethnography, archaeology, dialectology, metrics, and subjects related thereto. Although the exact balance of what we tend to study in linguistics may have shifted slightly since then, this expansive notion of what sources can contribute to the study of language and linguistics is representative of Bernard Comrie's work. The first year this professorship was awarded in 1948, it was recorded as the Hermann Collitz Professorship in Comparative Indo-European Grammar. Fortunately for us, we have since reversed both the restriction to Indo-European and the loss of Klara's name, while continuing to award this professorship to someone who takes a broad comparative approach to the study of language. Bernard Comrie is a distinguished professor of linguistics at UC Santa Barbara. He received his PhD in linguistics from the University of Cambridge, held positions at Cambridge and USC, and also previously served as the director of the Department of Linguistics at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, before taking up his current position in Santa Barbara. Among the many things you may know him for are his contributions to the study of typology and universals, including contributions to WALS, the World Atlas of Language Structures, editing the Mouton Grammar Library, an extensive collection of grammars of understudied languages, proposing the noun-phrase accessibility hierarchy along with Edward Keenan, and his books, such as Tense, Aspect, and of course, language universals and linguistic typology. And indeed, I have heard from multiple people at this institute that book specifically was what turned them on to the field of linguistics or solidified their interest in the field and in typology. Also at this institute, his class is probably the class that I have heard discussed the most among students, with people appreciating both his clear lecturing style and his quiet sense of humor. And institute directors, I would like to personally register a complaint that you scheduled my class against his, meaning that I could not attend. Fortunately for me and for us all, we have the opportunity now to hear about his work on Great Andamanese, an indigenous language of the Andaman Islands. So please join me in welcoming the Hermann and Klara Collitz Professor, Bernard Comrie.
The two scholars for whom this lecture is named, Hermann and Klara H. Collitz, were both Indo-Europeanists, working on perhaps the best studied language family in the world. Today I'm going to be talking to you about a language family which is arguably the least studied language family in the world. Certainly if you think of language families that have at least half a dozen or so languages in them. The work that I'm going to be reporting on is work in collaboration with an Italian colleague, Raoul Zamboni. In fact, it was Raoul who first got me interested in working on the materials on the Great Andamanese languages some 5-6 years ago. Since then, we have worked together in great detail, mainly in working out grammar, dictionaries of the languages to the extent that this is still possible, though also in terms of doing comparative work. A little bit of background. A number of people have approached me in advance of my lecture and told me that they needed some kind of refresher in geography. So that is where the Andaman Islands are located. part of a chain of islands. It's the northern part of a chain of islands. The southern part are called the Nicobar Islands. These islands, so the Andaman Islands, together with the Nicobar Islands, are administratively part of India, and have been since for at least the past 150 years. Though, as you see geographically, they form part of a chain that extends from north to south, going from roughly the coast of Burma, Myanmar, down to Sumatra, the westernmost large island of Indonesia. For most of human history, the indigenous inhabitants of the Andaman Islands were left to their own devices. However, in the middle of the 19th century, the British Indian administration decided that it needed a remote location to which to banish politically dangerous people from South Asia, from the then Indian Empire. Initially, as a result of the Indian Mutiny, so political prisoners, but then in later years, also murderers, sort of serious criminals, who it was felt were better off shipped off somewhere where they would be isolated from their original communities. Unfortunately, it did not leave them completely isolated from the indigenous inhabitants of the Andaman Islands, and especially those who spoke the great Andamanese languages, suffered a demographic collapse as a result of imported diseases. So even diseases like, let's say, measles, which are widespread in Europe, South Asia, many parts of the world, proved to be devastating to the local population. With the result that there was indeed a demographic collapse. The traditional Great Andamanese languages no longer have any speakers. Most of the communities no longer have any members. So it's not simply a case of language shift, people shifting to Hindi, which is now the dominant language of the islands, but it was actually a case of whole communities dying out. This map here gives you a somewhat schematic idea of the various languages, the various indigenous languages spoken in the Andaman Islands. On your handout, you also have a more schematic representation, which may be more useful when we actually come to talking about individual languages. There are two language families, at least, represented among the indigenous languages of the Andamans. The northern part, so roughly north of this line, the northern part are the great Andamanese languages. The southern part are the Ongan or Angan languages. The early British colonial administrators who worked with the indigenous populations very early on recognized that there were great similarities among the great Andamanese languages, and that the Ongan languages, Unge was the one they had most contact with, were very different. Indeed, even one of my predecessors as a Collitz lecturer, Joseph Greenberg, who suggested that the great Andamanese languages might be linked to the Papuan languages and the Tasmanian languages. We see no evidence for that, but he was prepared to make that claim. However, he did not make any explicit claim, even said that he was not able to do so, to make any explicit claim of links between Great Andamanese and Ongan. So, two very different language families. The Ongan languages are still alive. They are small communities. They are the communities which had least contact during the colonial and post-colonial periods with European and South Asian populations, and they were the ones who were best able to survive. I'm going to be talking primarily about Great Andamanese, but I will also mention, just to fill in the picture, the Ongan or Angan or Little Andamanese family. There are two languages that we know about, have a fair amount of documentation of. As I said, still spoken. Those are Jarawa and Unge. There is a third language, Sentinelese, which is virtually unattested. Some of you may recall that a few months ago, a would-be missionary tried to contact the inhabitants of North Sentinel Island and was killed by the local inhabitants. So this is a group which really wants to be left alone. The language is virtually unattested, not 100% unattested, but virtually so. Their culture is similar to that of the Jaroa and Unge, so the hypothesis is that this may be a third language of the Ongan family, but we don't actually know that. But I'll be concentrating on the Great Andamanese family. There are 10 traditional varieties, and notice I'm not yet committing myself as to whether these are languages or dialects, or even whether the distinction makes all that much sense in this context. There are 10 traditional ethno-linguistic varieties, all of them extinct. The first one started going extinct about 100 years ago, so we know there were members of such and such a community, Akabea for instance, in the 1921 census, but not in the 1931 census. So that was when the first languages started dying out. The last one, the last traditional language to be spoken by a group that now speaks Hindi, the last speaker died maybe in the early years of the 21st century, though that's not entirely clear. But all of the traditional varieties are now extinct. Here you have a list of the traditional varieties. I'll just mention the names the way I will pronounce them, so that you may recognize that when the names recur. So Akachari, this is roughly from north to south. Akachari, Akakora, Akabu, Akajeru, Akakede, Okojuoi, Okol, Okuchikwar, Akabea, Akarbale. One problem is that a lot of the names sound very similar to one another. The Aka or Oko bit at the beginning, or sometimes just O, is a prefix. And that seems to be common throughout the whole family in the language names. I may come back to that later on. So it's actually the last bit of the language name which is the most significant part. So those are the 10 varieties, traditional varieties that we know about, that were named by administrators, by anthropologists, alas, no linguists, no trained linguists working in the colonial period with indigenous languages of the Andaman Islands. I've also indicated there what kinds of material we have for each of these languages. You notice two of the languages are in italics, Akakora and Akabo. For those we have virtually nothing. So some lexical material, a few toponyms. In the case of Akabo, there is no attested lexical item that is distinct from Akajeru. So we don't really have evidence that it was even a separate variety, other than that we are told that it was a separate variety. Of course, bear in mind that if English were attested only to this extent, it might well have been possible that the attested lexical items of English would all have been identical to German lexical items, and people would be arguing whether there was ever really a separate language called English. So in many cases, the documentation is very minimal, but in other cases, it is much more extensive. So we have lexical material for pretty much all of the languages. For one of them, Akabea, we actually have a dictionary, rather extensive dictionary. For most, we also have things like toponyms or lists of affixes, a few short sentences. For a number, so for 4 of the languages, we have a phrase book. And this may seem a little bit odd. You may wonder, what were Berlitz and Lonely Planet doing on the Andaman Islands in the middle of the 19th century? Well, before the demographic collapse, there was one member of the local administration who was designated the Officer for Indigenous Inhabitants. And this person was charged with looking after the local inhabitants, also making sure that they didn't cause any trouble, and that when criminals escaped, they would help to track them down. So it was the basic kind of regular contact. But thinking about the future, not knowing that the languages by then would not really be spoken anymore. One in particular of the two officers for the Andamanese compiled a phrase book, so really is a phrase book, so a set of English phrases with their translations into 4 of the local languages. And this turns out actually to be the single most useful source for working out the grammar of the language. It might at first sight seem a rather strange corpus to work with. You might actually like to try it, buy the Lonely Planet phrasebook for a language you don't know, try and reconstruct the grammar from the expressions from the phrases in the book, and then compare it with linguistic grammar, see how close they are. But despite the limitations of the material, my colleague Raul Zamboni and I have found that these are extremely useful. The material presented is extremely consistent, even though the compiler of the phrasebook was not a trained linguist, was not a trained phonetician. That is a problem for trying to work out the phonetics of the language. He wasn't a trained linguist. That had obvious disadvantages, but also the advantage that he didn't have a theory of language or a theory of the grammar of the language that he wanted to try and impose. So it was, it seems to be observationally accurate and also a high level of internal consistency. So, as I mentioned, the documentation, it's all written, so this preceded audio recordings, at least in this part of the world. So the documentation is all written of the traditional varieties. It was all by non-linguists, by non-phoneticians. In particular, 3 people are involved, 2 government administrators, Portman and Mann, and an anthropologist, actually one of the founders of British social anthropology, Radcliffe Brown. Portman and Mann worked primarily in the south, but with great Andamanese languages, Radcliffe Brown primarily in the north. The documentations are somewhat different, so Portman and Mann did a fair amount of work on the grammar and the lexicon. As I mentioned, Portman compiled this phrasebook. Radcliffe Brown's documentation is almost exclusively lexical. There are a few sentences in the appendix which he added to the second edition of his book, The Andaman Islanders. The work, although it has been available for well over 100 years, has gone largely unanalyzed, largely unused by linguists until the work that Raul Zamboni and I have done on the traditional varieties. Despite the limitations that I've mentioned, you may recall from the list that I showed you, there are hardly any original texts, for instance. Despite the limitations, much reliable and consistent information can be extracted. As I've already mentioned, the limited materials for Akakora and Akabo present no forms distinct from Akajeru, so we can really say nothing about those varieties, other than what happens to have been said by those who observed them when they were used. The Akajeru lexical material, collected by Radcliffe Brown, although rich, lacks many items documented for other varieties. So he, of course, was an anthropologist, so he was interested in things like kinship terms, terms relating to burial practices, and so on, but was not that interested in words like stone, grass, and so on. So there are many gaps in the Akajeru material. In addition to the 10 traditional varieties, there is another variety which has come to be called present-day Great Andamanese, often abbreviated to PGA, which has now perhaps 5 rememberers, so not actually speakers, people who maybe spoke this variety as children, or younger days, have not spoken it for years, for decades, but nonetheless remember some of the language as it was spoken then. And this variety has been documented by Anvita Api, a linguist from India. She has produced a dictionary, a grammar, and the grammar includes a text. It's very good documentation. In fact, it's a wonderful piece of work because These are the last 5 rememberers. If she had not done this work, the language would probably have disappeared, this variety would probably have disappeared without ever being recorded. And all we would have had would have been the traditional varieties. By looking at her work, we can, for instance, reconstruct some phonetic oppositions, or phonological oppositions, that were missed by the non-linguistically trained people in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Interestingly, it may sound strange at first, but Abby's work on present-day Great Andamanese shows some loss of comparability with respect to the earlier documentation because it's better. This may seem strange, but if I give you an analogy, if English were not a well-documented language, you might find a word list of English which would include the words big and little. Okay, that's easy. Things you have to compare, there's big and there's little. Of course, since English is better documented, you know that in addition to big, there's also large. In addition to little, there's also small. And when you put those in, then that actually makes the comparability more difficult. And you can still do it, but you have to take into account a number of other parameters. And that's in a language family, a branch of a language family where we have lots of historical data, something which is lacking from the Great Andamanese family. Present-day Great Andamanese is essentially a later stage of Akajeru, so one of the northernmost languages. On your handout you have on the front page a schematic diagram with geographic locations of the different varieties. So it's essentially a later stage of Akajeru with some material from other northern varieties. But since we know so little about the other northern varieties, especially Akabo and Akakora, there's a temptation whenever we see something in present-day Great Andamanese that is not attested in Akajeru, and it's not obviously a loan from Hindi or English, then sort of tend to think, oh, maybe that's Akabo or Akakora. There's no way of verifying that conclusion. Okay, so this is the diagram you have on your handout showing the approximate location of the ethno-linguistic groups at the time of first contact, and it did not change that much during the colonial administration, except for the fact that roughly starting from the south working upwards, some of the ethnic groups, ethno-linguistic groups, became extinct. What can we say about the history of the Great Andamanese family? Well, with respect to recent history, we do have some documentation, and we have identifiable loan words that allow us to say something about contact with other languages. So we can see instances of contact with Hindi and English from loan words from those languages. So for instance, the Akabea word for a chicken is simply a loan word from Hindi murgi, meaning a chicken. It will be known to those of you who know Hindi and those of you who go to Indian restaurants. Word for biscuit, so English biscuit. Not sure exactly what that referred to, probably a ship's biscuit. Ship's biscuit is what you call it if you want to get someone to eat it. If you want to explain why you're not prepared to eat it, then it's called hardtack. Biscuit, so in Akabea, biscuit. One of the interesting typological features of the Great Andamanese languages is no phonemic fricatives. Not at all, not even S. So there are very recent loans. But there's also some vocabulary which suggests earlier contact with speakers of Austroasiatic languages. So many of the languages on the mainland of Southeast Asia are, or at the time would have been, Austroasiatic. The languages of the Nicobar Islands are Austroasiatic. So some evidence for contact with Austroasiatic and for contact with Austronesian. So one example from Austroasiatic, so Akabea Buch, a cooking pot, from similar to a Proto-Austroasiatic form. I'm not claiming the loan was specifically from Proto-Austroasiatic, but from some Austroasiatic language with a form similar to the form given there. The earliest archaeological evidence for pottery in the Andamans comes from just over 2,000 years ago, so we have a fairly good idea of when that word might have been borrowed. Contact with Austronesian, the word for an outrigger float, again, whether it certainly wasn't borrowed from Proto-Austronesian, it was borrowed from some Austronesian language. But it has been argued that outriggers were invented only once in the history of humanity, and that was by Austronesians. So every outrigger float descends either directly or indirectly from a Proto-Austronesian cultural item, and it's therefore not surprising that in Akabea the name for this object should also be a loan from Austronesian. And of course, since the Andaman Islands were occupied by two language families, although they seem to have kept in general rather to themselves, nonetheless there seems to have been some interaction. So there are some words which seem to have permeated that division. So the word for a leech, Akabea, a Great Andamanese language, the form is very similar to that found in the two known Ongan languages. The Akabea word is not cognate with the other known Great Andamanese languages. So probably a loan word, maybe a slightly greater probability of it being from Ongan into Akabea, though it could also have been an innovation in Akabea that then spread to the Ongan languages. But the question that I want to pose, the main question that I want to pose this evening, is going further back into the history of Great Andamanese. So we have these 10 ethno-linguistic varieties. What can we say about their subgrouping? Okay, so we have data from 8 of them. 2 of them we have no data, independent data, but for 8 of them we do have data. Can we come up with a subgrouping in the way that we can come up with a subgrouping of Indo-European languages, for instance? Well, before the work that led to tonight's presentation, there were 2 attempts at subgrouping of Great Andamanese. So one by Manoharan in 1983, the other by Comrie and Zamboni, the usual team, usual suspects, in a couple of years ago, 2017 publication. I will argue that the Manoharan classification is wrong, but to make up for that, I will argue that Comrie and Zamboni 2017 is also wrong. Then I'll show you what I think is right in light of our current knowledge. Okay, the subgrouping proposed by Manoharan, it's very consonant with the geographic distribution, and that will be true of all of the classifications that I will present. So he suggested that there is a well-defined South Andamanese group with the 2 languages, Akabea and Akabale. He suggested all of the other languages form a single non-South Andamanese group, subgroup, dividing in turn into North Andamanese and Middle Andamanese. North Andamanese has 4 varieties, Akachari, Akabo, Akakora, Akajeru. Remember, we have no independent evidence from Akabo and Akakora. We do for Akachari and Akajeru. Middle Andamanese includes Akakede, and that is going to be a point of controversy. So Middle Andamanese groups together Akakede, it groups together Okojuoi and Okol together with Opuchikwar. And you have that subgrouping on your handout, so you may find it helpful to compare the different subgroupings. The subgrouping that Raul Zamboni and I presented actually initially maybe 4 or 5 years ago, it was published 2 years ago, reproduces some of that. So we also have a South Andamanese group, which includes Akabea and Akabale. We have a North Andamanese, which includes the same 4 varieties as Manoharan included. But notice that we group Akakede together with the northern varieties, not together with the middle varieties. So that's one difference. And second difference is that our feeling at the time was that the Middle and South Andamanese languages group more closely together than either of them does with North Andamanese Akakede. So we have those two conflicting hypotheses. Question: what are the crucial differences between them? How can one resolve those differences? Now, there are substantial similarities. So both classifications agree that North Andamanese is a subgroup, is a valid subgroup. Both agree that South Andamanese is a valid subgroup. Both agree that Akakede, Okajuoi, Okol, and Okuchikwa all stand outside these two subgroups. So that's the agreement. But there are also substantial disagreements. So does Akakede group with North Andamanese, or does it group with the Middle Andamanese languages? Do Okajuoi, Okol, and Okuchikwa together constitute a subgroup? And does Middle Andamanese go together with the North Andamanese languages, or does it go together with the South Andamanese languages? Okay, so given that situation, how do we proceed from here? Two plans. Always a good idea to have plan A and plan B. Good idea to have plan B, but if you have plan B, you should also have plan A. A number of people have plan B, but no plan A is surprisingly large. Okay, plan A. Apply the comparative method. That's what we all know. It's all taught. We know that's the best way to go ahead. Most reliable way. Establish regular sound correspondences. Work out the shared innovations. Reconstruct the protoforms. And on that basis, draw a family tree of the great Andamanese languages. Unfortunately, the present state of our analysis of the material does not support this endeavor. Moreover, it is not clear to us that the surviving material is in principle sufficiently rich to support this endeavor. The way in which we have proceeded, we started off working on Akabea, the best documented language, then Akajeru, the second best documented language, and as you can see, it goes downhill. It must go downhill from there. So the extent that we will be able to extract material, grammatical, lexical generalizations from the surviving material is, if anything, going to get worse as we proceed to the other languages. So plan B. Plan B is a shortcut. It is certainly not guaranteed to give a correct result, but it is probably the best that we can do under the circumstances. And I say this, realizing that Hermann and Klara Collitz are probably looking down at me, sort of checking that I am indeed fulfilling the conditions of their request. So I can say to them, I will probably not be able to do as well as Indo-Europeanists have done, or certainly not, but I'll do the best I can, and I hope that will, if it isn't sufficient, that at least it will be accepted. So one way of progressing would be the way in which we followed. That was to establish comparative word lists. So we used the Swadesh 200 word list, simply because that's a widely available list and one which includes a large part of the basic vocabulary that's likely to be shared across languages and that is likely to be documented even in less well-documented language varieties. We identified lookalikes, and I'll come back to that term, lookalike, in a moment. So we identified lookalikes. Then for each pair of varieties, we might, for instance, take Akabea and Akabale, or we might take Akabea and Akajeru, Okuchikwa and Akajeru. So for each pair of varieties, we would then identify the number of lookalikes, divide this by the total number of items for which data are available for the two varieties, This then gives you a similarity index, a lexical similarity index for each pair of varieties. There are a number of reservations one would have to have with respect to this methodology, and those I will come to in a moment. But let's see how this might work. In this chart, in this table, you have some lexical items from our comparative word list. So these are all lexical items from the existing material with some phonological and especially phonetic interpretation. So what we did was we asked, say for the word for hand, is the word for hand in Akachari, the one to the far left, the same as or different from the forms for Akajeru, present-day Great Andamanese, Akakede, and so on, all the way through to Akavale. By saying the same or similar, it's a subjective judgment, although given the nature of the data, it turns out that in most cases the subjective judgments are very reliable. If we do intersubjective tests, then both Raoul and I in general agreed on what would count as a lookalike and what would not count as a lookalike. So the word for hand, we have a root kora, koro, kori, so very similar forms across all of the Great Andamanese languages. So for those we say the same form for our purposes, lookalikes for all of the varieties, the tested traditional varieties and also present-day Great Andamanese. The word for bark, this is bark of a tree. We have forms like kobo in Akachari through to Akakede, but from Okojuoi through to Akavale, we have a different root. We have the root aich. The loss of the K in Akabea aich is a frequent phenomenon. The initial K very drops after a following consonant. So that would suggest that for that lexical item, the languages Akachari through to Akakede belong together. They are distinct from another group, Okojuoi through to Akavale, which also belong together. The verb to die, is the root here, il, for the first languages, but Akabea and Akavale have a completely different root, li. So there we group together the first 8 languages, 7 languages, distinct group from the last 2 languages. The word for at, well, it's actually a clitic, so the form il is found in Akachari through Akakede. The form an is found in Okojuoi through Okuchikwa, and the form len is found in Akabea through Akavale. So there we identify 3 groups. So those are some illustrative entries to show how we proceeded. Maybe a couple of things that you note there, so maybe I should go into a little bit more detail. So identifying lookalikes is subjective. So it's not applying the comparative method to finding cognates. We cannot claim that the words we have identified as lookalikes are indeed cognates. I suspect many of them would turn out to be cognates, though we may never know, but at any rate we're not making that claim. So we were able to reach consensus on all cases. This project concentrates on lexical morphemes. So we hope in a later project to look at grammatical morphemes. So since it's looking at lexical morphemes, it disregards differences in affixes. So if you look, for instance, at the word for hand, there is a root, kora, which is the same across, or similar across all of the languages. However, the languages differ in the prefix that is attached to that. So in some languages it's ong, in some languages it's a form re or er. So there are basically 2 different possibilities there. Those prefixes, you'll see something similar in the word for bark and also in the verb actually something different in the verb to die, but also in the verb to bark. Those are body part prefixes or somatic prefixes. They're a characteristic feature of great Andamanese languages. A large part of the lexicon of the language is built up of roots preceded by one of probably originally maybe around 10 somatic prefixes. You may recall that the names of the languages nearly all begin with aka or oko or some derivative of that. That's a prefix which means mouth. So the ethno-linguistic groups were identified apparently by their speech, by the things that came out of their mouths. Akabea, for instance, there is a spring or a well, so a natural source of water. So Akabea is the language of the people who live by the spring. Another point to note, so in general we're looking at lexical morphemes. However, if the equivalent of a Swadesh list item is an affix, then we include that affix. So the word for at, the English word at, English preposition at, the equivalent in Great Andamanese languages is a clitic, post-clitic, and clitic, but we included that. So the unit of measurement is always an item in the Swadesh list. Just to keep everything consistent, that is what we use as our point of comparison. Now, once you have done all of that, you can easily compile a table which shows the number of lookalikes across each pair, for each pair of Great Andamanese varieties. So the figures that you see in the sort of top right part of the table, the first one is the number of lookalikes for that pair of languages. The second number is the number of items in the Swadesh list for which we have evidence in the attested material. You notice that in general, for the individual languages on this 200 list, we have 150, roughly 150 and up lexical items, which is good. However, there are some, in particular Akajeru, where we only have 62. So although Akajeru lexicon is in general copiously attested, this is the one which was attested, which was compiled by an anthropologist, so they reflected his interests rather than a linguist's interests. So for instance, comparing Akachari and Akajeru, the number of lexical items which are given for both languages is only 58. 54 of those are lookalikes. So the top right hand gives you the number of lookalikes relative to the total number of lexical items attested for both of the languages in that pair. And at the bottom left, you have the corresponding percentages. If you look at those percentages, you don't really need to do very much sort of sophisticated mathematics or anything, even arithmetic, to see that there are some of the percentages that are very high, and there's then a big gap with other percentages that are much lower. And in this next version of the table, what I have done is to highlight in blue the percentages that are high. So high here means 65% and upwards. And the non-highlighted ones are the low percentages, so they are all 40% and down. So on the basis of this material, the languages fall very clearly into three groups. So one group, Akachari, Akajeru, present-day Great Andamanese, and Akapede, with 65% and up. A second group, Okojuwai, Okol, and Okuchikwa, with percentages in the 80s and 90s. And then the last pair, Akabea and Akabale, with the similarity index of around 80%. If you want to use more modern methods, you can also visualize that. So this is a neighbor net representation of exactly the same material. So you can see the three clusters, so one cluster here. This is actually the northern group, including Akakede, another group here in the middle, and this group here down in the south. So the results that emerge from that, there's robust support for three main groups. Bearing in mind these are groups defined in terms of lexical similarity. So there's robust support for three main groups. One is North Andamanese Akakede. Akakede seems clearly, on this measure, to go with North Andamanese, not, as Manoharan argued, with Middle Andamanese. Middle Andamanese, so the rest of Manoharan's Middle Andamanese, that seems to be a solid group. Likewise, South Andamanese is a solid group. There's also strong support for dividing North Andamanese Akakede into two subgroups, North Andamanese and Akakede. There's no strong support, as we see there's weaker support, there's no strong support for any further subgrouping among the three major groups. Given this, we may now ask, well, why did other people, so Manoharan and also Comrie and Zamboni in a previous incarnation, why did they come up with different analyses? For Manoharan, it's rather difficult to be very specific because his paper does not really contain much linguistic information. He just presents the classification and you believe it or you don't. But why did he consider that Kede, so what we call Akakede, might belong with the Middle Andamanese languages rather than, as we think very clearly, with North Andamanese? Well, we can get some information here by looking at the more detailed ethnography provided by Portman and Mann and Radcliffe Brown. So Portman tells us the Kede tribe, though generally at feud with its neighbours of the South Andamanese group, which his terminology includes our Middle Andamanese and South Andamanese, shows in names and some customs a resemblance to the tribes of that group. And the fusion between the groups, which is slight, has taken place between the Kede and Okojuoi tribes on the west side. So it looks like in the recent history, so recent in Portman's terms, so say he was making these observations maybe in the 1870s. So his observation was that the Kede, although different from the Middle Andamanese, had recently entered into contact with the Middle Andamanese. And it may well be that Manoharan's judgment was based on this later accommodation rather than on any explicit linguistic information. Certainly this is the best explanation that we can come up with. Why did Manoharan group North Andamanese and Middle Andamanese together as opposed to South Andamanese? We don't know. Can't even speculate on that. Okay, now the mea culpa, this is the nostra culpa, saying that to the Indo-Europeanists. Why did Comrie and Zamboni group South Andamanese and Middle Andamanese together as opposed to North Andamanese? Well, at the time, the only North Andamanese material we had analyzed was the material for Akajeru, which we had then together with the present-day Great Andamanese material from Ambita Abi's studies. And that material did indeed suggest this grouping. We're now working on the Akachari material. This is much more extensive than the Akajeru material, 4 words included in the Swadesh list, and on the basis of this later material, the picture has changed considerably. We now do not see any strong evidence for grouping South and Middle Andamanese together. Okay, so let's now ask, so what is the family tree relation among the 3 main groups? North Andamanese Akakede, Middle Andamanese, and South Andamanese. Well, if we look at North Andamanese Akakede in comparison with Middle Andamanese, the two languages with the closest, the highest similarity pair index have 40%. If we compare Middle Andamanese with South Andamanese, the highest percentage is 39%. So barely distinguishable, and maybe another linguist looking at the same lists might have reassigned one of the lexical items and the figures would have been the other way around. North Andamanese and South Andamanese, the two geographic extremes, there the closest similarity pair index is only 24%, so that's clearly different. So Middle Andamanese stands midway between North Andamanese Akakede on the one hand and South Andamanese on the other. This is not immediately compatible with any family tree. So family tree would either have three primary branches, in which case you'd expect, other things being equal, the three groups should be roughly equidistant, or it would have two primary branches, one encompassing two of the subgroups, but we find no evidence for either of those. Middle Andamanese stands in between North Andamanese Akakede and South Andamanese. So the pattern is more reminiscent of dialect distribution. If you look at maps of dialect distribution within a language, then you're quite likely to see extremes that are very different, but transitional dialects in between dialects in the area in between the extremes. So one hypothesis, emphasize it can only be a hypothesis at this stage, one hypothesis would be perhaps there was originally a dialect continuum, subsequently individual varieties became more distinguished, more differentiated from one another, maybe intermediate varieties were lost, giving rise ultimately to the current three groups, but with Middle Andamanese still intermediate between the other two groups. There are other, more complex scenarios that one could imagine. So you could imagine an original situation with two primary branches, and then subsequently Middle Andamanese undergoing extensive borrowing from the group outside its primary branch. That would also give you the result which we observe, though it's a somewhat more complex scenario. So that's roughly what we can say about the higher level subgrouping of the family. What about the lower level groupings? I emphasize these are not particularly robust, given the limited material and the closeness of the similarity indices as you get down to this low level. The subgrouping of South Andamanese is uncontroversial. There are only two varieties, and there's only one way of subgrouping two varieties, assuming one is not a descendant of the other, which is not the case here. So for South Andamanese, the issue doesn't arise. For North Andamanese, only two sufficiently attested traditional varieties are known, so again, the issue doesn't arise. However, the attested traditional varieties are sufficiently close, if you look at the similarity percentages, so well up in the 90s, are sufficiently close to raise the question whether they might be dialects rather than distinct languages. Bearing in mind these may well be terms that we are imposing on the local situation, it's not clear that the speakers of Great Andamanese varieties ever really considered the question of whether they were speaking the same language as their neighbors. Clearly they were speaking something which was different, even if they might have understood them. We do have some observations here from Radcliffe Brown. So the languages of the North Andaman, which are closely related. Elsewhere in his work, he does sometimes refer to dialects of North Andamanese. So clearly for him, whatever exactly he meant by those terms, this was a kind of borderline category. He recognized that at least some of the varieties were very close to one another. Elsewhere, he says, a man of the Akajeru tribe could understand without any great difficulty a man speaking Akabo. And I fear that this is the gender-neutral use of man. Some people, seeing this quote, have asked me, does that mean that the women could not understand each other? I do not think that is what Radcliffe Brown meant. He was a Cambridge man from the early part of the 20th century, and from what I know of such people, I think his use of terminology would not meet current LSA standards. What about Middle Andamanese? There are three languages, Okajuoi, Okol, and Okuchikwa. Manoharan groups Okajuoi and Okol together as opposed to Okuchikwa. Our material suggests rather grouping Okol and Okuchikwa together as opposed to Okajuoi. Well, again, Portman comes in with some useful remarks. So the Puchikwa and Kol languages differ from those mentioned above, but resemble each other in many ways. Those Puchikwa living at the eastern end of Humphrey Strait speak a mixed dialect of Puchikwa and Kol. The Okajuoi language, so the third Middle Andamanese language, the Okajuoi language, is very different from any of the others in the group, the nearest being Kol. So this, Portman suggests separating Okajuoi from Okol and Puchikwa, the same analysis that we came up with, the same suggestion that we came up with, although we do not show Okajuoi being closer to Okol than it is to Puchikwa. Indeed, both from our material, the high percentage of lookalikes, and what Portman says, it may well have been that Okol and Puchikwa constituted a dialect continuum, so there were intermediate varieties that were not readily identifiable as being one or the other. So, just to summarize, what I have tried to show is that even in the case of a language family where we have very limited material, where we are probably not going to find new material, I do of course occasionally have dreams about somebody finding a shoebox in Radcliffe Brown's attic, which will contain all the texts that he recorded, or the texts that he wrote down in Akajeru, but I think it's extremely likely, over 100 years since he did his field work, no one has come up with that. Man does have an archive in London at the Royal Anthropological Institute, and I have worked through that archive, and there is not much material other than what was already available. We have incorporated what other material we have found. So it may well be that the picture that I have presented, Plan B, so not an application of the comparative method, but rather an application of looking for lookalikes and then establishing indices of lexical similarities across languages, leading to the three-way grouping, North Andamanese, Akakele, Middle Andamanese, South Andamanese, that may be the best that we will be able to come up with. Of course, it's also possible that as Raoul and I work through the materials for the other languages, Akachari may well be the one that we will do next, as we work through that other material, maybe especially the Middle Andamanese material, it may well be that new insights will emerge which will enable us to improve on that picture, or even if the picture remains the same, to provide more solid underpinning for the picture. So what I think we can do, in one sense, we're doing the same as the Indo-Europeanists have done. We've done the best that we can. Now, Indo-Europeanists have much more material, so they can come up with much more solid conclusions. We cannot do that, certainly not with the material that we have at our disposal at present, but nonetheless, we have tried to do the best that we can. We cannot claim that this is the family tree of the great Andamanese languages, but it is a plausible family tree. It is the best we can come up with in the present state of our knowledge. I'd like to make one final set of comments before I finish. Obviously, in preparing this talk, preparing all of our work on the great Andamanese languages, Raoul and I have been making use of material that was collected by intermediaries, European intermediaries, but which ultimately was provided by the native speakers of the languages in question, members of communities which in most cases do not even exist today as communities. In the case of North Andamanese, yes, there is still a present-day Great Andamanese community, though the language is not in regular use in the community, and Amrita Abdi, working maybe about 10, 12 years ago, was only able to find a half dozen rememberers of the language. I would like to be able to say something about the debt that we owe to the speakers of the languages, and it would be nice to be able to say that in somehow we are perpetuating some aspects of their language and culture, but I do not want to exaggerate what it is possible to do there. I certainly cannot stand up here and say, I am providing a voice for the speakers of Great Andamanese languages. What was recorded of their language was not what they wanted to say. What was recorded was what colonial intermediaries wanted them to say, what they asked them to say. So unlike Amrita Abdi, who was able to provide a voice to the surviving rememberers of present-day Great Andamanese, Raoul and I are not, in that sense, able to provide a voice to the speakers of the traditional Great Andamanese languages. What we can do, it's not as good, but again, the best that we can do is to make the material from their languages available so that at least part of their intangible cultural heritage, namely their language, will survive in the sense that it will be accessible to others. These will now, for the most part, be people from outside their communities, but others will nonetheless have access to that material. They will be able to see not only the intricate patterns of genealogical descent and language contact that might have led to the lexical similarity indices that I have spoken of this evening, but also we will be able to see some of the intricate grammatical patterns that existed in the Great Andamanese languages, including some phenomena that are typologically extremely unusual. So maybe in that sense, at least the languages of the Great Andamanese family do live on, not in the mouths of their speakers, not even in the way that their speakers might have wanted them to live on, but still do live on as part of our general understanding of human cultural heritage. So I'd like to thank you for your attention. I would like to thank my colleague Raoul Zamboni for the collaboration that has led to this work. I'd also like to thank the co-directors of the Institute for allowing me to present this material, even after they read the abstract. And of course I would like to thank all those who helped to organize these lectures and the Institute, including the student helpers, for making this an event that has, from my perspective, run so smoothly, which can only mean that there were people taking care of all of the roughnesses that inevitably arise in such an enterprise. Thank you.
That was fantastic. Thanks. I have a question about why give up on Plan A so fast? I'm wondering whether you couldn't do what you did spectacularly with Plan B, but nevertheless look for whatever possible sound correspondence you could get out of the material and look for innovations there. There seem to be some sound correspondence you could have gotten. And then look at the grammar and see what kind of innovations you could have gotten out of the grammar. Possibly then, Middle Andamanese might actually end up subgrouping well with either the North or the South and not be this intermediate step that's not so good.
Okay, as I mentioned, we have not yet done the grammatical reconstruction, but even done the grammatical lookalikes. in part because we need to do more work on the grammars of the languages other than Akabea. We have worked out as well as we can the grammar of Akabea. So it's certainly possible that as we work through the other material, we will find, for instance, grammatical morphemes that suggest strongly grouping of one way rather than the other. It's also possible that as we work on the lexicons, the dictionaries of the other languages, that things will emerge, get larger sets of cognates, lookalikes, which can maybe then be shown to be cognates, likely cognates, with regular sound correspondences. However, one thing which we do know is that as we go from Akabea and Akajeru to the other languages, the amount of material decreases fairly rapidly. The interpretability of the material decreases. Akabea was the language spoken around Port Blair, the settlement that was established by the British in the Andaman Islands. So that's where the administrators were based. One of them, Man, appears essentially to have spent all his time there. The other Portman seems to have travelled much more widely, including going hunting, camping with the local people. But nonetheless, he was based in Port Blair, and he was if there was trouble, he had to be in Port Blair to take care of whatever incidents might arise. So the quality of the material for the other languages is lower than the quality of the material for Akabea. But we haven't worked on that material in detail yet, so Plan A has not been abandoned. As I said, the present state of our knowledge, we're not able to implement Plan A. We did the best we could, namely Plan B. Our hope is that we will be able to implement Plan A, but I cannot guarantee. It's not, working on some language families, we might say, well, we know there's all this good material out there, so eventually we will put it all together, we'll be able to work out the regular sound correspondences and so on and so forth. I don't see any guarantee in the Great Andamanese material of that happening, but it might.
I've got a question for Mike. So, thank you, Bernard, for a very enlightening talk. I know you know this because you are the college professor, after all. But lest anyone get the idea that even with the wealth of information you have about Indo-European, that all the problems have been solved, that's certainly not the case. And some of the still open questions have to do exactly with details of subgrouping, either within the various across the various branches of the language family, or within individual branches. So it may be that you're right. You make the most of the data that you have, and but even with a wealth of data, there's still going to be things that are maybe never resolved to anyone's satisfaction.
Right. Indeed, as part of my preparation for this evening, I decided to take a quick look at essentially my notes from when I was a student studying Slavic linguistics, and sort of looking at the criteria for the division of Slavic into West, East, and South. And to be honest, I was quite shocked how weak some of the evidence is. Why take this feature, why not this other feature, which would give you a different subgrouping? South Slavic is a special problem, I think, with the subgrouping. Not that many features that are common to all and only South Slavic. East Slavic is easy because at the early period you're only dealing with one language, probably only one language, but in between those, a lot of uncertainties. So I would agree, it's not necessarily the case that having more information makes things easier. As I suggested with that early English word list that only had the words big and little, as you get more information, things can actually become more complex.
Questions? Hello. We're trying to look at similarity metrics. So I find that for each language, the number of words are not always the same, right?
That's simply the attestation that we have. Remember that for the languages that are included in the phrase book, there is a high degree of comparability because the same phrases were being translated into those 4 languages. For the other languages, it is very much hit and miss which lexical items are attested. So, although you might think that 200 words Swadesh, those are pretty basic concepts. Surely anyone who lived in the area and did a study of the language, surely they would at least include those lexical items. Well, the answer is no. And in the case of Akajeru, the figure is actually quite low. About a third of the lexical items Swadesh list are included. And that depends, of course, on the different interests which the different recorders had, on their training. It's interesting that Radcliffe Brown, who is probably the linguistically most sophisticated of the 3, actually gives us the smallest amount of usable lexical items, not because he gathered so few lexical items. He actually gathered lots of lexical items from Akajeru and a few from other varieties of North Andamanese, not all was identified. So there are some items that are otherwise unidentified North Andamanese. But he was an anthropologist. He was interested in the kind of vocabulary that related to rituals, marriage patterns, and so on, that he was interested in. So you have lots of lexical items, but most of them are not in the Swadesh list. So that's the material we have. It's conceivable there may be things that we have missed, so as we look in more detail, we may find some additional lexical items for the languages we haven't yet worked on in such detail. Although it's rather unlikely where we have the parallel texts, the phrase books, the lexical items are usually easily recognizable across the languages. So, as I said, unless we discover a hitherto unknown archive, it would be wonderful. We might have to rewrite everything, but still it would be wonderful. Unless we discover that, possibly, because it's conceivable if someone else does work with present-day Great Andamanese. I don't even know if that is still feasible, whether the rememberers still remember, whether they're still alive. It's conceivable more information might come from that. But the basic picture is we have a fixed corpus for this language, and it's not going to change, probably. Questions?
Thank you. I enjoyed this talk very much, especially your thoughtful comments at the end. But I'm just curious about the phrase book data. Could you tell us a little bit more about the kind of information that's in the phrase books? Okay.
So Portman's idea was, he assumed that he would have successors as officer for the Andamanese. In fact, he didn't. This was early in his career there. He decided that he should write a phrase book of phrases that would be useful to an Indian government, a British Indian government official, dealing with the indigenous inhabitants of the Andaman Islands. Now, some of these are, of course, ordinary phrases, kind of, how are you, kind of, how is your health, kind of phrase. Some of them are obviously linked to the kinds of interactions that were judged most useful. So, as I mentioned, the indigenous inhabitants were used to help track down escaped criminals. So you have very useful phrases of, you must help me track down this escaped criminal. There are expressions relating to the health problems that the local people had. So warning, you should not associate with people who have this disease, and often venereal diseases, which were introduced quite early. To local customs, my all-time favorite phrase from the phrase book, and I will give an explanation, it's not as bad as it sounds out of context, This very short phrase, this woman is wearing a skull. Okay? Why is she wearing a skull? Well, the local tradition was that when one of your relatives, a close relative, died, you preserved the bones for a while, and you would wear some of the bones as an ornament to show how attached you were to that relative. So in the culture, it's of course a perfectly normal situation, but it does give rise to that. So it of course means in those 4 Anglo-Viennese languages we know the word for skull. We also know that for Akajeru because that was something that Radcliffe Brown was also interested in. But other things could be missed. The phrase book, some of the adjacent phrases are presented as a kind of mini dialogue, but it's not clear they were really elicited that way, or even if they were elicited that way. Remember, there was no audio recording available, so it was somebody, Boardman, presumably writing down what he heard. He doesn't say exactly how he elicited the material, so whether he worked with people who knew some English, whether he had to work through Hindi, I don't know. So you would ask one sentence, and of course by the time the second sentence comes around, even if it's a response to the first sentence, it's quite likely that the speaker will have forgotten that. So there are sometimes strange things go on, say with pronouns. It should say he or she, but it actually says they. It's not always clear why. So there are problems of that kind. Also, should maybe point out, I mentioned there are very few texts. First of all, Akabea, the best documented language, is really only one full story text, one half story text, and a couple of songs where the speakers themselves said they didn't understand all of the words, all of the forms. But even for present-day Great Anglo-Viennese, so Anvita Abbey worked with these rememberers, and in her grammar there is a text, but she is very explicit about how the text was gathered. She would work with the person who was the best rememberer, and she would say at the beginning, tell me a story. We would say the first sentence. I don't remember the rest. And the next day, I remembered another sentence. So they then get another sentence. So although it's presented as if a continuous text, it's very clear that it isn't really a continuous text. So it would be rather hard to make claims about discourse structure, for instance, from that. And Abby's grammar is quite explicit about that, so there's no hiding of the fact that that there are severe limitations in the documentation.
We can take a few more questions.
People working on distance matrices like the one that you're proposing here try to use the differences in percentages to probe the time depth of the distance between languages. I'm just wondering whether, to the extent to which these metrics are reliable and applicable to your case, I'm just wondering whether you can use this kind of metrics to evaluate the hypothesis of the continuum.
Yeah.
Because apparently some percentages are quite small.
Yeah. Perhaps to be more accurate to say some linguists try to make claims about time depths on the basis of such percentages. And myself am somewhat skeptical of the possibility of doing that. I mean, it makes assumptions about fixed rates of lexical replacement, which I think find very little basis in actual historical linguistic work. But for what it's worth, if you try and apply, say, glottochronological methods to these matrices, then for the more distant languages, you get time depths of around 5,000 to 6,000 years, which in other respects seems implausible. In the early administrators working with the languages sort of recognizing that these languages have lots of similarities. They were never, I don't know if they actually thought in terms of language families, They might have done, it was already at the time when they might have known about that. It was clear to them, the great Andamanese languages are all close, related to one another. The Ongan languages, so Unge, the one that they knew a fair amount about, they recognized that was very, very different. So I think a time depth comparable to Indo-European seems on other grounds unlikely for the great Andamanese language family. So obviously there are issues that would need to be resolved there. Were there factors in the local culture that led to unusually rapid rates of lexical replacement? There might have been. I've come across that in parts of New Guinea where I've worked, where word taboo can lead to surprisingly rapid rates of lexical replacement, even observable across generations. But my sense is that the data are probably not sufficiently robust to be able to make any valid claims about absolute chronological depth. I would certainly not want to make any such claims.
Thank you for a wonderful lecture. I wonder whether you would just be willing to give us a little preview of some of the typological rarities that you've alluded to.
Okay, one I've already alluded to, namely the body part prefixes. So it's characteristic of all the great Andamanese languages, and though to a lesser extent also of the Ongan languages. This seems to be one typological feature that they have in common, although the Ongan system is much less rich. So a large part of the vocabulary has these body part prefixes. We have called them somatic prefixes in our work. So each of the prefixes refers prototypically to a body part, so aka to the mouth, another one might be to the ear, to the extremities, so to the hands and feet, and so on. But they then have extended meanings, a kind of grammaticalization or semantic extension. So things referring to the mouth can refer to language and anything connected with language. They can refer to food. And since most food in the local culture traditionally came from trees, then we can refer to trees as well. And since you make canoes out of trees, it can refer to canoes as well. And since Europeans have big canoes, which they call ships, it can refer to ships as well. And the people who are on the ships, the sailors, you can refer to them. You can put that prefix on that word as well. So you get long chains of extensions. This is found, there are some other parts of the world, so some indigenous languages of the Americas also have rich systems of somatic body part affixes. But in terms of languages of the world as a whole, it's a rather rare system, so that would be part of the structuring of the lexicon. In terms of grammar, the most unusual feature we've come across is one that we call verb-root ellipsis. And we actually have a recent publication on that. It came out maybe just a couple of months ago, a publication on morphology with Edinburgh University Press. Verb-root ellipsis, what this means is that, especially under appropriate pragmatic conditions, let's say the answer to a question, a speaker could omit the root of the verb, retrievable from the previous turn in the conversation, but leaving all the affixes and the clitics there. In terms of content, I suppose the closest equivalent in English might be if someone says, have you written your paper? I might reply, yes, I have. Well, have doesn't actually convey much information. What you wanted to know was about the writing of the paper, but I sort of ellipsed that because that was in what you said. But in English, of course, what I ellipse is a whole word. So, yes, I have written, the verb write with its participle suffix, all of that gets omitted. I suppose the equivalent in a great Andamanese language, or in Akabea, would be if the response was, I have. Okay, so I have, and then the past participle ending. Of course, since we don't have audio recordings, it's not really clear how exactly these were pronounced, but judging by the orthographic representations, it seems that where you just had suffixes left, they were attached as part of the preceding phonological word. But if what was left was prefixes and suffixes, and maybe with clitics there as well, but no root, then that was a separate phonological word. Now, this is a very unusual phenomenon, and you might say, if your only evidence for it is from Akabea and to a lesser extent, maybe from a couple of other great Endomanese languages, then we're not going to believe you. Okay? Well, it turns out this is a phenomenon that has been attested in a couple of other languages. It's been attested in Inuktitut, but not apparently in other Eskimoan languages. So in Inuktitut, and Shanley Allen, who was here a couple of days ago for a conference, has a co-authored paper looking at that phenomenon in Inuktitut, and also in Quasa, which is a language isolate of Bolivian Amazonia. So there are two other languages where the same phenomenon is clearly attested. You obviously only find it in languages that have a certain amount of verb morphology, but the possibility of omitting the root, keeping the affixes. It's somewhat different, though obviously shares some similarities, with the phenomenon of zero roots, which you find in some languages, where, for instance, you might have the verb to give, will have a zero root, and you will attach a subject, a direct object, and an indirect object affix to it. And what it says is, I something's it to you, but of course it means I gave it to you. So some languages will have zero roots. So you have similar phonological problems. How do you pronounce this thing, which has no root? The solutions seem to be different in different languages depending on the prosodic structure of the language in question. So zero roots and verb root ellipsis present somewhat similar issues, but they are different phenomena. On the one hand, it's a lexical property, so a zero root. Some roots have a well-defined semantics, but their phonological representation is zero. On the other hand, with verb root ellipsis, the verb basically has a phonological representation, perfectly good phonological representation, but you can drop it under appropriate pragmatic circumstances. So those are a couple of the phenomena, maybe the two most interesting ones.
Let's thank our speaker. Thank you so much.